What if the crowns of Europe hid not strength, but broken bloodlines that turned inward until they devoured themselves? Behind the portraits of queens, the pageantry of courts, and the promises of divine rule, a far darker truth was at work, one that shaped kingdoms, silenced heirs, and left entire dynasties in ruins. Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tonight we descend into the hidden corridors of royal history, where obsession with pure blood created not immortality, but extinction. Across centuries, kings and queens believed their power came from keeping bloodlines sealed, marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, even brothers and sisters. It was a system that promised stability, yet it produced bodies twisted by deformity, minds collapsing into madness, and heirs who never lived to inherit their crowns. What we uncover is not the grandeur of empire, but its genetic fragility. Portraits preserved in galleries conceal children lost in infancy. Thrones that seemed unshakable were hollowed out by weakness and silence. And rulers remembered as divine or legendary were, in truth, prisoners of their own lineage. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it for you? Write it down in the comments below, and let us know how far this story travels. And if you are drawn to the shadows of history, to the hidden truths that linger behind power, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. Because what follows is not the story of triumphs carved in stone, but of empires undone by the very blood that crowned them. This is the story of Europe's most inbred queens, their lives preserved as warnings, their legacies whispered through the silence of their own extinction. What if the crowns of Europe hid not strength, but broken bloodlines that folded in on themselves? Beneath the polished portraits and gilded insignia of Europe's monarchies ran a truth that was not spoken aloud. Dynasties were not expanding outward like the branches of a tree, but circling in upon themselves like a tightening loop. For centuries, royal families believed they were protecting their thrones by sealing their bloodlines against the intrusion of outsiders. In doing so, they imprisoned themselves within chambers of repetition, marriages between cousins, unions between uncles and nieces, even brother and sister. The practice was deliberate, calculated, and justified by politics. Alliances were fragile in medieval and early modern Europe, and rulers believed that only marriage within the family could guarantee loyalty. A cousin was less likely to betray than a stranger. A niece bound by blood was thought safer than a foreign bride with her own loyalties. In their desire for stability, monarchs created a system that valued purity of lineage over diversity of inheritance. What followed was the slow poisoning of their own houses. The genealogies of Spain's Habsburgs and Austria's emperors resemble not trees but wheels. Philip IV of Spain married his own niece, concentrating the family's blood to the point of collapse. Leopold I of Austria wed his niece Margarita Theresa, a union between uncle and child that collapsed generations of separation into a single, perilous link. In Egypt, centuries earlier, the Ptolemies had done the same, brother to sister, generation after generation, believing themselves divine even as their bodies betrayed them. The cost was measurable. Children born into these dynasties displayed the telltale deformities of compressed bloodlines, jaws so pronounced that mouths could not close, spines that curved under the weight of inherited weakness, heirs, indes, that faltered into hallucination and mania. The famed Habsburg jaw became a symbol of how visible deformity can emerge when families collapse inward. Haemophilia spread silently through the descendants of Queen Victoria, turning simple injuries into lingering deaths. In courts across Europe, madness was explained away as divine trial or melancholia, when in truth it was written in the genes of generations. Historians have often noted how royal portraits emphasize symmetry, grandeur, and stability. Yet these paintings conceal what physicians whispered in private chambers, that heirs were fragile, marriages sterile, and rulers themselves were prisoners of their own blood. Kings and queens ruled nations, but could not escape the limits of their own inheritance. By the 17th century, entire dynasties were visibly withering. The Spanish Habsburgs produced Charles II, a king incapable of ruling and incapable of producing an heir, his body a map of accumulated genetic ruin. In Britain, the Hanoverians carried madness as an heirloom, culminating in George III's fractured mind. In Portugal, Maria I's descent into religious mania revealed the cost of generations of calculated incest. The pursuit of purity created only collapse. The family trees of Europe's monarchies had ceased to branch, growing instead into closed circles, closed systems that sealed in weakness, disease, and despair. Behind the crowns and coronations, behind the carven coats of arms, lay not strength but fragility disguised as tradition. Power was preserved, humanity was sacrificed. What happens when one gene passes through an empire like a silent assassin? Princess Victoria Melita was born in 1876 into a world of glittering titles and gilded expectations, yet her inheritance carried more than crowns and coats of arms. As the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she carried in her bloodline the most infamous genetic curse of European royalty, haemophilia. What appeared as a hidden weakness in one monarch became, through generations of cousin marriages, a slow devastation that moved silently across Europe's palaces. Her parents, Prince Alfred of Edinburgh and Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, were themselves products of dynastic calculation rather than compatibility. Both descended from carefully orchestrated unions within the narrow circle of European royalty. For centuries, such marriages were designed to secure alliances and consolidate power. Yet these choices tightened the genetic pool until inheritance became less a blessing than a trap. Victoria's first marriage was to her cousin, Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse, in 1894. At the time, cousin marriage was not only common but considered almost obligatory among Europe's ruling families. This union produced a daughter, Elizabeth, whose brief childhood ended in meningitis. The grief tore through the marriage, already strained by the couple's incompatibility, and the two separated under the heavy disapproval of their courts. Behind the pomp of royal weddings lay the recurring truth. The blood that bound these families together also destroyed them from within. Her second marriage, to Grand Duke Cyril Vladimirovich of Russia, appeared at first to offer renewal, yet the shadow of her inheritance continued its destructive course. Their children were born into the same genetic trap, several carrying the haemophilia gene that had passed like a concealed thread from Queen Victoria into nearly every royal house of Europe. The disease was merciless. A minor cut could bleed endlessly. A fall could lead to internal hemorrhage and death. In an age before modern medicine, this single mutation shaped the politics of nations, destabilizing dynasties through the frailty of their heirs. For Victoria Melita, the weight of this knowledge grew unbearable. She watched as her lineage became marked by fragility and loss. In court records and private letters, she appears increasingly withdrawn, her spirit eroded by what she could neither prevent nor repair. Depression consumed her later years, isolating her from the very society her birth had destined her to rule. When she died in 1936, she had lived through the collapse of the world she was born to represent. The Russian monarchy was destroyed, the German houses weakened, and the British crown stripped of its continental power. The haemophilia that haunted her family had played its quiet role in that disintegration, not only killing children but altering the course of empires. Princess Victoria Melita remains a figure not of triumph, but of warning. Her story is not of personal scandal or political betrayal, but of a silent genetic inheritance that undermined the very structures it was meant to preserve. In her life, the glitter of royalty was slowly eclipsed by the shadow of a single gene, carried forward like an assassin that struck without sound, but with devastating precision. In Velázquez's brushstrokes we see not beauty, but fragility, preserved for eternity. Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain was born in 1651 into a dynasty already collapsing inward. She was the daughter of King Philip IV and his niece, Maria Anna of Austria. Their union was no aberration, but part of a pattern repeated so often that the Spanish Habsburg family tree ceased to resemble a branching structure at all. Instead, it folded back upon itself, compressing bloodlines until they became indistinguishable. The young Infanta became famous not for her life, but for her image. Court painter Diego Velázquez immortalized her in canvases that now hang in the world's most renowned museums. In Las Meninas and other portraits, Margarita Teresa stands at the center, her pale skin and elaborate dresses capturing the viewer's gaze. Yet beneath the ornate gowns and solemn posture was a child already marked by centuries of cousin marriages. The Habsburg jaw, elongated, heavy, unmistakable, was present in her line, and in her body the weight of genetic fragility settled early. Accounts from the court describe her as sickly, suffering from fevers, digestive troubles and chronic weakness that confined her to bed for long periods. Physicians, unable to comprehend the genetic root, blamed the air, the climate, or the will of God. Yet modern analysis reveals the more chilling truth. She bore the accumulated damage of generations who had treated kinship as a tool of politics rather than survival. At the age of 14, she was married to her uncle, Leopold I of Austria, another tightening of the genetic circle. The marriage, considered acceptable by royal standards, joined niece and uncle in a bond that would have been unthinkable outside the palace walls. Their children, born of blood already dangerously compressed, did not survive into adulthood. Each loss was another silent marker of dynastic decline, as if the body itself refused to sustain the lineage any longer. Her life ended at 21, the age when most are just beginning to define themselves. The cause was less a single illness than the gradual erosion of vitality passed down through a family that had made incest a policy. She died in Vienna, far from the Madrid court, where her image still gazed out from Velázquez's canvas. The empire that had surrounded her with ceremony and ritual could not protect her from the silent inheritance of her blood. And yet Margarita Teresa survives, on canvas. To modern eyes, her image carries a strange unease. She appears solemn, almost spectral, the fragile figure around which servants and courtiers orbit in Las Meninas. Historians note the sadness etched into her childlike features, a stillness as though she bore some unspoken knowledge of her condition. The paintings that were meant to display the grandeur of Spain now serve as evidence of its genetic decline. Infanta Margarita Teresa's life was brief, her body fragile, her dynasty in collapse. But her portraits endure, frozen in oil and light. They preserve not triumph, but warning, an eternal reminder that even the most gilded bloodlines can carry within them the seeds of their own extinction. A girl remembered for rumors of survival, but doomed long before her execution. Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia was born in 1901, the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. To the outside world she appeared another cherished child of Europe's most opulent court. But beneath the shimmering chandeliers of the Alexander Palace, her blood carried the same silent inheritance that had stalked her royal kin for generations. The Romanovs were not merely a dynasty. They were the endpoint of centuries of cousin marriages that bound the Russian throne to the courts of Britain, Denmark, and Germany. Through Queen Victoria of England, haemophilia entered their bloodline like a hidden parasite. Though Anastasia herself was spared the disease, her brother Alexei carried it, and his fragile body dictated the rhythm of family life. Every stumble, every bruise risked a hemorrhage that might claim his life. Anastasia grew up under this shadow. Her household was not governed by tutors or courtiers, but by the constant threat of her brother's bleeding. Yet the family's burden extended beyond Alexei. Anastasia's own health was frail. Court records describe recurring fevers, respiratory infections, and long bouts of fatigue that left her confined to her bed. What physicians called nervous exhaustion may have been the outward signs of compressed inheritance, recessive weaknesses made visible by the dynasty's narrowed gene pool. Her tutors observed something more subtle: difficulties in concentration, short temper, restlessness. In hindsight, these may have been signs of cognitive strain, symptoms whispered by modern geneticists as consequences of repeated consanguineous unions. The palace walls amplified these conditions, turning fragility into isolation. As the First World War pressed against Russia's borders, Anastasia became increasingly withdrawn, suffering from what were described as nervous disturbances, panic spells, and depressive episodes. The Romanovs, unaware of the science but aware of their shame, concealed these weaknesses. Court physicians invented elaborate explanations. Priests framed them as spiritual trials. To admit the truth that the empire itself was being hollowed by its blood would have been to confess that their reign was already collapsing. When the revolution came in 1917, it was not simply a political reckoning, but the unmaking of a house already withered from within. In July 1918, Anastasia, her siblings, and her parents were herded into a basement in Ekaterinburg. The bullets and bayonets of the Bolsheviks ended the Romanov line in one night. She was only 17 years old. For decades, myths persisted that Anastasia had survived, escaping the cellar and building another life in secret. Impostors arose in Germany, in America, in distant corners of Europe, claiming her name. Each story captured a desperate longing to believe that one child had escaped the dynasty's ruin. But DNA evidence has silenced the legends. The remains discovered in shallow graves confirmed what the bloodline itself had always foretold. There was no survival. Anastasia's tragedy lies not in the cellar where her life was ended, but in the fragile inheritance that made her doom inevitable. Hers was a dynasty already closing upon itself, a cul-de-sac of bloodlines that left no way forward. The bullets of revolution only finished what genetics had already begun. What if the crown itself was worn by a mind collapsing under its own bloodline? Maria I of Portugal was born in 1734, heir to a throne already compromised by centuries of deliberate inbreeding. Her father, King José I, had himself been the product of a cousin marriage. From birth, Maria's inheritance was not only political, but genetic, an ancestry compressed until its branches folded back upon themselves. Her destiny was sealed by marriage. At 26, she was wed to her uncle, Pedro III, in a union that further concentrated the family's already narrow gene pool. This was not unusual in Iberian courts. Such marriages were praised as prudent, ensuring loyalty remained within the family, but the genetic coefficient of their union exceeded even that of half-siblings. The Portuguese crown had become less a symbol of divine right than of calculated self-destruction. Maria began her reign in 1777 with intelligence and religious devotion. Yet these very traits became the channels through which madness took hold. At first, her instability was described as melancholy, understandable in a queen burdened by grief. She lost her husband, and soon after, her eldest son. These shocks broke what little resilience her bloodline permitted. What began as episodes of sadness shifted into fevered mania. Court witnesses recorded her compulsive confessions, her fixation on imagined sins, her refusal of food for days at a time. She screamed through the night of devils pursuing her, of curses engraved upon her bloodline. Ministers, priests, and physicians struggled to explain her decline. Some called it religious fervor, others whispered of possession. In truth, it was the inheritance of generations who had treated marriage as a political game, collapsing choice until madness itself was the inevitable result. Her children, born of uncle and niece, displayed the fragility expected of such concentrate ancestry. Some survived to adulthood, but each carried vulnerabilities. The dynasty was no longer a vessel of stability, it had become a laboratory of hereditary ruin. By 1792, Maria's deterioration could no longer be ignored. She was declared mentally unfit to rule. Her son João was named regent, while she lived on as a shadow in the palace, still queen in name, but captive to her broken mind. Physicians attempted the remedies of their age: bloodletting, purges, immersion in cold baths. Nothing slowed the descent. The queen remained trapped in cycles of mania, prayer, and hallucination. She lived this way for over 2 decades, a monarch reduced to a figure of dread within her own walls. The Portuguese court learned to function without her, but her presence lingered like a reminder of the cost exacted by bloodline obsession. In 1816, death came not as a release from rule, but from torment itself. Maria Guarme is remembered in history as Maria the Mad, yet her madness was no isolated misfortune. It was the logical outcome of incestuous unions repeated until the mind itself began to fracture. Her reign marked the moment when the crown of Portugal no longer symbolized power, but the weight of a bloodline collapsing inward. What if the hope of a nation ended in a single failed birth? Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was born in 1796, the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent, later George IV. At her birth, she represented the golden hope of the Hanoverian dynasty, young, beloved by the people, and poised to secure the stability of the crown. Yet her fate, like so many heirs before her, was bound by the hidden weaknesses of her bloodline. The Hanoverians had carried instability from the moment they crossed the Channel in 1714. Madness had already plagued the dynasty. Her grandfather, George III, suffered from porphyria, a genetic disorder that left him raving, restrained, and incapable of rule for long stretches of his reign. His decline became public spectacle, a monarch undone not by armies, but by his own body. The dynasty that held an empire in its grasp was already known for its fragility. Charlotte's father embodied further decline. Obese, addicted to alcohol and laudanum, George IV bore the marks of hereditary weakness, compounded by indulgence. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, Charlotte's mother, was itself a union between cousins. The match dissolved almost immediately after her birth, leaving Charlotte raised in a fractured household. Her early years were shaped not by stability, but by the volatile inheritance of a bloodline that mistook endurance for strength. Charlotte herself displayed signs of fragility. Descriptions from her physicians suggest irregular cycles and sudden shifts in temperament, conditions that modern observers would interpret as hormonal imbalance and nervous instability, both common outcomes in compressed genealogies. Yet the public adored her. She was seen as fresh, untainted by the scandals of her father's court, a living promise that Britain's monarchy could recover its dignity. Her marriage in 1816 to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg meant that hope. For once a royal union appeared both affectionate and politically sound, but the promise was fragile. In 1817, Charlotte became pregnant, and from the outset, Complications shadowed her condition. Swelling, severe discomfort, and unexplained symptoms were recorded, yet her physicians misjudged the dangers. Labor stretched over 50 hours. The child, a stillborn son, bore signs of congenital weakness. Charlotte herself bled and weakened beyond recovery. Hours later, she was dead at the age of 21. Britain, which had pinned its hopes on her survival, was thrown into mourning so profound that shops closed, church bells tolled for days, and the nation's grief bordered on despair. The succession crisis that followed reshaped the monarchy. With no heir from Charlotte, the Hanoverian line scrambled for continuity. Her uncles rushed into marriages, producing heirs that would eventually lead to the birth of Queen Victoria, a child who inherited the same haemophilia curse that would ripple through Europe. Charlotte's death revealed the truth that portraits and ceremonies concealed. The monarchy stood on foundations of weakness. A single failed birth was enough to plunge an empire into uncertainty. Behind the mourning draperies and public grief lay the cold reality that Britain's future had been extinguished not by foreign enemies, but by the fragility of its own bloodline. When daughters are pawns, their bodies become experiments in blood. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, wielded influence that stretched across France and England. Through her marriages to Louis VII of France and later Henry II of England, she controlled vast lands and shaped the fate of kingdoms. Yet the legacy of her daughters reveals another side of power: the use of women not as sovereigns, but as conduits of blood. In their marriages, the royal houses of Europe condensed their genetic material into narrower and narrower channels, trading vitality for alliance. Medieval Europe offered few options for royal daughters. They were instruments of diplomacy, wed to cousins and uncles across Christendom to secure treaties, lands, and loyalty. Eleanor's daughters, Marie, Alix, Eleanor, Joan, and Matilda, were no exceptions. Each was placed within a dynastic circle that had already been folding inward for generations. The noble houses of Capet, Plantagenet, and Castile were entangled webs where kinship repeated upon itself, reshaping family trees into tightly bound knots. The outcomes of these unions were grimly predictable. Marie of Champagne, Eleanor's eldest daughter, was married to Henry I of Champagne, whose family had already practiced cousin marriage for decades. Chroniclers described her fits of melancholia, long periods of incapacitating sadness, and repeated miscarriages. Children who survived birth often died in infancy, their short lives a quiet record of what compressed inheritance could yield. Eleanor of Castile fared no better. Married to Alfonso VIII of Castile, she bore 12 children, but only 3 survived into adulthood. Accounts suggest the others succumbed to wasting illnesses, fevers, or birth deformities. In an age without the language of genetics, such tragedies were attributed to divine punishment, yet those patterns were too consistent, too repetitive, to be dismissed as coincidence. Joan of Sicily carried perhaps the heaviest burden. Married first to William II of Sicily and later to Raymond VI of Toulouse, she suffered health problems described as mad fits. Chroniclers spoke of sudden rages, disorientation, and lapses into incoherence, symptoms that echo the hereditary mental disturbances documented in later dynasties similarly bound by consanguineous unions. Her decline was not addressed with understanding but with confinement. She died in a convent, her body aged prematurely, her mind long since broken. The pattern was clear across Eleanor's daughters: stillbirths, miscarriages, weak heirs, and illnesses unrelieved by any remedy known to their time. Where their mother had been seen as formidable and indomitable, her daughters became fragile vessels through which dynastic alliances were maintained at the expense of survival itself. These women did not wield swords or crowns. Their contribution to history was written in bloodlines and marked in graves. Their bodies were leveraged for power, but their offspring bore the consequences of bloodlines that had been too carefully guarded, too jealously protected. The medieval chroniclers lacked the words for genetic collapse, yet they recorded what they could: daughters who wept, mothers who buried their infants, wives who lost themselves to madness. In these accounts, one sees the beginnings of a cycle that would echo across centuries of European royalty. The dynasties that sought strength in closed unions instead laid the groundwork for fragility, a weakness passed forward like an heirloom. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters were not merely pawns of politics. They were early witnesses to a pattern that would continue through empires: dynastic power bought at the expense of health, vitality, and sanity. Their short lives and fragile offspring serve as some of the earliest recorded evidence of how inbreeding transformed royal households into experiments with human cost. What happens when a family tree becomes a perfect circle? Infanta Maria Antonia of Austria was born in 1669, the daughter of Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and his niece, Margarita Teresa of Spain. In her birth, the Habsburg dynasty committed itself to a union so close that its branches could no longer be distinguished. It was an uncle-niece marriage, yet its genetic coefficient surpassed even that of siblings. The family tree had tightened into a closed ring, the culmination of 2 centuries of careful, destructive calculation. The Habsburgs had long treated blood not as biology, but as currency. Every marriage was a transaction designed to keep power concentrated within a handful of European houses. With each repetition of cousin and uncle marriages, the gene pool shrank. By the time of Maria Antonia's birth, the dynasty had reached a mathematical endpoint. She embodied the statistical limit of what a lineage could endure before collapse. The signs were written upon her body. Court records describe her with the pronounced Habsburg jaw, so exaggerated that her teeth could not meet. Eating and speaking were labored, her jaw visibly misaligned. Her spine was curved with scoliosis, forcing her to walk with a limp and endure chronic pain. The deformities were not isolated defects, but the cumulative inheritance of centuries of compressed ancestry. Her mind, too, bore the weight of this legacy. Though educated by the finest tutors, reports from the court noted her inability to concentrate for extended periods, and her difficulty with abstract thought. She struggled with lessons that her less inbred cousins mastered easily. The same pattern repeated across Habsburg households: bright bloodlines dulled by their own narrowing circle, intelligence clouded by what was demanded in the name of dynastic preservation. Marriage was expected and marriage was arranged. At 16, Antonia was wed to Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria. Yet even this union, meant to extend the reach of the dynasty, brought no lasting heirs. She suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Each pregnancy ended in failure, as if her body itself could no longer sustain the weight of her blood. For a dynasty obsessed with succession, this was more than personal tragedy. It was the quiet signal of extinction. She died at the age of 33. The official accounts noted her passing with ceremony, but the truth was more stark. Her life marked the dead end of a dynasty that had treated generations as experiments in consanguinity. Her death was less an individual event than the natural conclusion of a mathematical equation long in the making. Maria Antonia has no surviving descendants. Her line stopped with her, a silent admission that the circle had closed too tightly to continue. In her deformities, her struggles, and her barren womb, the Habsburg experiment reached its inevitable conclusion. She is remembered faintly, often overshadowed by her cousin Charles II of Spain, whose own grotesque inheritance became infamous. Yet Maria Antonia represents something more chilling, the moment where a family tree ceases to function as a tree at all. Her existence demonstrates how dynastic ambition, when pursued through closed blood, creates not immortality, but collapse. The circle had closed, and with it the future of her line. What if grief and madness were not chance, but inheritance? Joanna of Castile, born in 1479 to Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, entered the world as the embodiment of Spain's rising power. Her parents had united crowns, expanded empires, and set the stage for global conquest. Yet within their celebrated marriage lay a quieter legacy, a bloodline narrowed by centuries of Iberian cousin unions. Joanna inherited not only the grandeur of empire, but also the latent instability bred into her family tree. Her marriage in 1496 to Philip of Habsburg, known as the Handsome, was designed to bind Spain to the Holy Roman Empire. Politically, it was a triumph, joining two of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Genetically, it was catastrophic. The Habsburgs, already notorious for their repeated intermarriages, folded their inheritance into Joanna's. In their children, the bloodlines of Spain and Austria met not to diversify, but to further compress. The first signs of Joanna's instability were noticed early but excused. She displayed moods that swung from fervent devotion to sudden despair, traits her contemporaries interpreted as piety and passion. But the true rupture came with Philip's sudden death in 1506. Grief in most would have been consuming. In Joanna, it became unrelenting obsession. She refused to bury her husband's body, keeping his coffin near her and travelling with it across Spain. Chroniclers wrote of nights where she demanded the coffin be opened, convinced Philip would wake, or fearful that other women might steal his remains. These behaviours, while shocking to her contemporaries, were not without precedent in her bloodline. Her grandmother, Isabella of Portugal, had suffered profound melancholia. Other Trastamara relatives had displayed madness, paranoia, or incapacitating religious fervour. Joanna's collapse was less an aberration than a continuation of this hereditary pattern, sharpened by grief and intensified by her Habsburg marriage. Her confinement began under her father Ferdinand, who declared her incapable of ruling Castile. Later, her son Charles, soon to become Emperor Charles V, maintained the imprisonment, ensuring that her name remained tied to the throne, but her body bound behind walls. She lived most of her life at the palace of Tordesillas, locked away for nearly half a century. Guards recorded her long silences, sudden rages, and episodes of catatonia. Priests described her terrified confessions of being poisoned. She passed days in isolation, her windows shuttered, her voice echoing only in prayer or lament. The legend of Juana la Loca grew out of these accounts, turning her into a symbol of Spain's fragility, a queen defined less by rule than by ruin. Yet behind the legend was the cold arithmetic of inheritance. Her blood carried the residues of repeated cousin marriages, genetic traits that predisposed her to instability. Her grief may have been real, but her descent was also written in her lineage. Joanna died in 1555, still confined, long after her voice had ceased to matter in matters of state. She left behind children who carried forward both her empire and her damaged inheritance. In her story, the grandeur of Spain was shadowed by a single truth, that even an empire can be undone from within when its rulers inherit not only thrones, but madness. The tomb of Tutankhamun hid not just treasure, but evidence of genetic ruin. Ankhesenamun, born around 1348 BCE, was the daughter of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. She entered the world already bound by the practice that had shaped Egypt's royal house for centuries, sibling marriage, justified by the belief that the pharaoh's blood was divine and must remain untouched by outsiders. What religion sanctified, genetics condemned. Her father, Akhenaten had overturned Egypt's pantheon to elevate the Aten, the sun disk, above all gods. Yet his most lasting legacy may not have been religious, but biological. By marrying his own sister, he ensured that his children, including Ankhesenamun, carried the compressed inheritance of dynasties that had treated incest as state policy for over a millennium. In this world, the sacred duty of preserving bloodlines created silent, irreversible damage. When her half-brother Tutankhamun ascended the throne at a young age, Ankhesenamun was given to him as wife. The marriage united two bodies already mirror images of the same lineage. Their union was meant to stabilize a fragile throne, but it represented the culmination of centuries of genetic narrowing. The cost of this tradition was preserved in the Valley of the Kings. In 1922, when Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb, he found not only the treasures that captivated the world, but also two tiny mummies, designated 317A and 377B. These were the stillborn daughters of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun. Each fetus bore the unmistakable signs of genetic catastrophe: severe spinal deformities, evidence of scoliosis and spina bifida, cranial abnormalities, and malformed limbs. Modern CT scans and DNA analysis confirmed what ancient silence concealed. Their deaths were not the result of chance, but of bloodlines drawn too tightly together. Ankhesenamun herself appears to have suffered the weight of this inheritance. Records from her time are scarce, yet fragments suggest ill health and desperation. Letters discovered in the Hittite archives describe a widow queen of Egypt pleading for a foreign prince to be sent to her as husband, a rare appeal that would have broken centuries of tradition. Historians identify this widow as Ankhesenamun, her request reflecting both political vulnerability and an unspoken recognition that her own bloodline had become a trap. The plea was denied. Shortly after Tutankhamun's death, she vanished from the record, her fate unmarked in Egyptian history. Her disappearance is almost as haunting as her daughter's preserved remains. The two mummified infants, fragile, motionless, placed alongside their father, stand as testimonies that speak louder than inscriptions. They reveal a dynasty that had sealed itself off so completely that life could no longer be sustained. The gold and lapis of Tutankhamun's burial mask conceal a truth as stark as bone. Even in the most powerful households, lineage narrowed into silence. Ankhesenamun is remembered faintly, her name echoing only in fragments, but her legacy lies preserved in those two small bodies. In them, the sacred practice of sibling marriage revealed its cost. What had been proclaimed divine was in fact destructive. Her story closes not with triumph or continuity, but with the quiet stillness of infants who never breathed, entombed as evidence that blood, when folded endlessly upon itself, yields only ruin. The most famous queen of all time carried one of the most broken bloodlines in history. Cleopatra VII, Philopator, born in 69 BCE, was the last sovereign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a house that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. To her contemporaries, she was the embodiment of cunning and charisma, a ruler who spoke 9 languages, commanded fleets, and bent the will of Rome's greatest generals. Yet her brilliance existed within a body shaped by a dynasty that had long mistaken incest for divinity. The Ptolemies, descended from Macedonian conquerors, had embraced the Egyptian tradition of sibling marriage. They believed the royal blood of the pharaoh was divine and must not be diluted by foreign unions. For nearly 300 years, brothers married sisters, generation after generation, until the family tree resembled not a branching structure, but a ladder, vertical, rigid, unchanging. The genetic consequence of this practice was staggering. Modern analysis suggests that Cleopatra's inbreeding coefficient was 6 times higher than that of a child born to first cousins. For comparison, where cousin marriages may carry risk, Cleopatra's bloodline had been folded so many times upon itself that genetic diversity was all but extinguished. She was the final heir of a dynasty already collapsing under its own sacred traditions. Contemporary accounts describe her as captivating, but rarely in terms of beauty. Roman writers noted her intelligence, her voice, and her charisma, yet also recorded signs of frailty. Some sources mention irregular health, digestive ailments, and periods of withdrawal. Fertility, the very foundation of dynastic survival, seemed compromised. Despite her unions with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, Cleopatra bore only 4 known children. Of these, 2 disappeared from the record, 1 was executed, and 1, Cleopatra Selene, survived only by Mars, rying into another royal line. For a woman whose reign depended on heirs, this scarcity was itself a symptom of her lineage's collapse. The grandeur of her court masked decline. Gold, marble, and ceremony preserved the illusion of strength, but the blood beneath was fragile. The very policy meant to protect divine status had instead eroded the dynasty's capacity to endure. Cleopatra's intelligence allowed her to outmaneuver rivals and temporarily secure her throne, but no brilliance of mind could compensate for the narrowing of her body's inheritance. Her death in 30 BCE has long been shrouded in legend, an asp's bite, self-poisoning, or assisted suicide. Whatever the method, it marked not only the end of her life, but the extinction of the Ptolemaic dynasty. With her, 3 centuries of deliberate inbreeding concluded, leaving no lasting heirs to carry the line. The divine blood had not been preserved, it had been consumed. Cleopatra remains immortal in history, not because of her dynasty's survival, but because she embodied its final contradiction. She was a ruler of immense brilliance, commanding the loyalty of nations, yet trapped within a body weakened by the very tradition meant to secure her reign. In her, the grandeur of Egypt's last pharaoh was inseparable from the fragility of a bloodline collapsing inward. What if dynasties produced heirs only to bury them? In the gilded nurseries of Europe's palaces, the sound of lullabies was often followed by silence. For centuries, dynasties bound by cousin and sibling marriages gave birth not to legacies, but to fragile lives that flickered briefly and went out. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and infant deaths were not isolated tragedies. They were the rhythm of royal households, a reminder that the pursuit of pure blood brought not continuity, but erasure. The Spanish Habsburgs provide one of the most haunting records. Court documents list births in careful succession, yet beside each name appears the same notation: dead within weeks, gone within months, miscarried before term. The Infanta Margarita Teresa, herself the daughter of an uncle-niece union, bore children who never survived infancy. Maria Antonia of Austria endured pregnancy after pregnancy, each ending in miscarriage or stillbirth. In the family ledgers, the names of children are sometimes recorded only as nacido muerto, born dead. The pattern extended far beyond Spain. In Portugal, Maria I lost multiple children in infancy. In England, the Hanoverians struggled with pregnancies that ended before heirs could be secured. Princess Charlotte Augusta, the golden hope of Britain, endured 50 hours of labour, only to deliver a stillborn son, her own life extinguished in the attempt. Across Europe, the shrines and cradles of royal nurseries became monuments to loss. Infant mortality was common in the wider world of the Middle Ages and early modern period, but within these dynasties, the rates were extraordinary. Modern geneticists point to the obvious. Compressed bloodlines produced vulnerabilities that rendered children unable to thrive. Disorders of the blood, fragile bones, undeveloped organs, conditions invisible to their parents but inscribed within their DNA. The very practices designed to preserve dynasties undermined their survival, ensuring that half the children born within palaces would never see adulthood. The grief of these families was often concealed, buried beneath ceremony. Official records might state that a child died of fever or weakness, terms so broad they concealed the hereditary nature of the problem. Mothers withdrew into mourning chambers, sometimes emerging shattered, while fathers negotiated new marriages to try again. The cycle repeated endlessly, pregnancies celebrated, heirs anticipated, only to be carried to small graves within weeks. Behind these private tragedies lay public consequences. Thrones were passed not through abundance of heirs, but through survival of the fittest among the frail. Succession crises erupted when lines failed. Wars ignited over who might inherit what blood could no longer provide. The fate of kingdoms was decided not on battlefields but in royal nurseries, where silence too often replaced the cries of newborns. The silent heirs rarely appear in paintings, their likenesses seldom preserved. They exist instead as gaps in genealogies, as marginal notes in baptismal registers, as empty cradles in inventories of court possessions. Yet their absence shaped history. Dynasties fell not only because of external enemies, but because their own children never lived long enough to rule. In these forgotten infants lies the most chilling truth of inbred royalty, that bloodlines defended at such terrible cost could not sustain life itself. Power was preserved, but life was lost, again and again, in silence. What if the crown itself carried madness in its veins? In the chronicles of Europe's monarchies, the descent into insanity was not an accident of fate, but a repeated pattern. Across centuries, rulers confined by inbred bloodlines found their minds faltering under the same weight that deformed their bodies. Madness was not random here. It was inherited, passed through generations like any other crown jewel, though this heirloom brought not power, but ruin. George III of Britain stands as the most familiar figure of this legacy. His reign, stretching over 6 decades, was punctuated by terrifying episodes of collapse. He raved incoherently, spoke to the air, and believed himself conversing with angels. Servants recorded nights where he spoke for hours without pause, his words dissolving into unintelligible fragments. The diagnosis of his age was madness. Modern analysis points to porphyria, a genetic disorder affecting the nervous system. The condition was not isolated. It ran through his descendants, shadowing Britain's ruling family with the constant threat of recurrence. In Portugal, Maria I became known as Maria the Mad. Her descent into mania followed the familiar path of dynastic collapse. Daughter of a cousin marriage and wife to her uncle, her genetic burden was immense. Personal tragedies, the deaths of her husband and son, opened a fissure her inheritance could not withstand. She withdrew into religious obsession, confessing imagined sins, shrieking through the night of demons and curses. Her decline was so severe she was declared unfit to rule, living her last decades as a prisoner of her own mind. The crown remained intact, but its wearer had dissolved. Joanna of Castile, remembered as Juana la Loca, carried the same hereditary weakness. The daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, her marriage to Philip of Habsburg further narrowed an already compressed lineages. And when Philip died suddenly, grief ignited the latent instability she carried. She refused to bury his body, keeping his coffin beside her for years, convinced he still lived. Her confinement lasted nearly 50 years. Her name preserved in royal titles, while her body was sealed away in darkness. The pattern repeated across houses and centuries. Madness appeared where bloodlines were compressed. Obsessive religiosity, psychosis, manic episodes, paranoia. Chroniclers, lacking science, interpreted these collapses as divine punishment or spiritual trial. Physicians prescribed cold baths, bloodletting and confinement. None understood the truth. This was the arithmetic of inheritance, the outcome of family trees collapsing into themselves. These rulers commanded armies, signed treaties, and oversaw empires, yet they were captives within their own minds. Their madness became a spectacle, whispered in courts, recorded in documents, preserved in rumor. Subjects prayed for their recovery. Ministers schemed around their incapacity, but none could escape the fact that their decline was not chance. It was systemic, built into the very bloodlines that were supposed to secure power. The crown, that symbol of stability, often rested on the heads of those whose sanity had already begun to fray. In their trembling hands and fractured voices, the illusion of strength was undone. Dynasties preserved their blood, but what they preserved was not endurance, it was instability, a hereditary ghost that haunted palaces as surely as any political threat. Madness in these families was not an interruption, it was the inheritance. What if kingdoms fell not from armies, but from their own blood? Across Europe, dynasties that once seemed eternal dissolved not under foreign assault, but through their own genetic fragility. The crowns that had passed for centuries within, sealed families grew too heavy for the weakened bodies and unstable minds that inherited them. Thrones were not toppled by steel alone, but by the brittleness of bloodlines that had folded in on themselves until they could no longer bear the weight of empire. The collapse of Spain under the Habsburgs stands as one of the most visible examples. Generations of uncle-niece and cousin marriages produced a king who became the very emblem of dynastic extinction, Charles II. His jaw protruded so severely he struggled to chew, his tongue so enlarged that speech was often incomprehensible. Infertile and chronically ill, he represented not a ruler but a biological endpoint. When he died in 1700 without an heir, the Spanish crown passed into crisis, sparking the War of Spanish Succession. It was not conquest that ended Habsburg Spain, but centuries of genetic narrowing that yielded a monarch incapable of reproduction. Centuries later in Russia, the Romanovs met their end in a cellar in Ekaterinburg. Officially, their annihilation was political, the Bolshevik revolutionaries silencing the old order. Yet beneath this execution lay decades of inherited weakness. Hemophilia, carried through Queen Victoria's line, had turned the heir Alexei into a fragile figure whose health dictated the empire's politics. His bleeding disorder drew the mystic Rasputin into the royal household, corroding public confidence and accelerating revolution. The Romanovs were not merely overthrown, they had been weakened from within, undone by the fragility of the very child meant to secure their line. In Britain, the Hanoverians endured but carried instability that shook the monarchy. George III's long collapse into madness revealed a dynasty unable to provide steady leadership. His illness, rooted in hereditary porphyria, left him raving and confined, his ministers ruling in his name while his mind fractured. His granddaughter Charlotte Augusta, the hope of a nation, died at 21 after delivering a stillborn child, plunging the monarchy into a succession crisis that only narrowly resolved with the birth of Queen Victoria. Each episode underscored the fragility of a house that had promised continuity but delivered uncertainty. The pattern was unmistakable. Where dynasties had bred for purity, they became brittle. The very obsession with preserving divine bloodlines created heirs too weak to fulfill their roles. Monarchies fell into crises, not because their palaces were stormed, but because their nurseries fell silent, their heirs sickened, and their rulers descended into madness. Revolutions followed in the wake of these weaknesses. Spain's decline opened the door for Bourbon, and later Republican dominance. Russia's instability made the collapse of the empire inevitable once war and famine struck. Britain survived, but only through the luck of one heir's endurance. Blood had accomplished what armies often could not: the erosion of legitimacy, the collapse of stability, the quiet hollowing of empires from within. The fall of thrones was not always marked by battlefields or treaties. Sometimes it was written in blood, blood too heavily guarded, too jealously preserved until it turned against itself. Dynasties that sought immortality and purity found only extinction. When blood becomes currency, the cost is always death. Across centuries, thrones were defended not only by armies and treaties, but by the bedchambers of palaces. Monarchs calculated marriages as carefully as wars, trading daughters as tokens, binding cousins to cousins, and closing the circle ever tighter. Humans became vessels, their bodies carrying not individuality but lineage, their futures sacrificed to the preservation of dynastic names. What began as a strategy for stability hardened into ritual, a cycle of incest that consumed generations. The result was always the same. Where lines should have branched outward, they curled inward. Family trees became circles. The consequence was visible in every era. Jaws elongated, spines twisted, blood clotting at the slightest wound, minds unraveling into mania and paranoia. In these rulers one could read not the glory of empires, but the arithmetic of decline. Joanna of Castile carried her husband's coffin through convent halls, her mind collapsing under the weight of a compressed inheritance. Maria I of Portugal shrieked of demons in her chambers, undone by the same dynastic purity that crowned her. Charles II of Spain, sterile and incoherent, embodied the endpoint of 2 centuries of uncle-niece marriages. Cleopatra, brilliant and calculating, reigned at the pinnacle of her dynasty, only to see her lineage extinguished with her death. Behind each throne stood women whose lives revealed the true cost. Infants buried before their names were remembered, mothers broken by repeated miscarriages, heirs condemned before they were born. These were not isolated tragedies, but systemic consequences. Bloodlines bred for purity created not strength, but fragility. Monarchs sought continuity through incest, and instead ensured extinction. Thrones were left childless, or passed to heirs too sick to rule. Dynasties collapsed not from external conquest, but from within, undone by their refusal to allow new blood to enter their veins. The political consequences were vast. Spain's Habsburgs dissolved into crisis after Charles II's death, their empire fragmented by foreign claimants. The Romanovs, undermined by the weakness of their haemophiliac heir, collapsed into revolution. Britain's Hanoverians, haunted by madness and succession crises, survived only through the chance endurance of Victoria. In every case, blood had been treated as divine, yet it proved mortal, vulnerable, finite. What remains is not resolution, but warning. History records the crowns, the treaties, the palaces. But within those archives lies another narrative. The silent graves of infants, the confined rooms of mad queens, the broken bodies of monarchs shaped by their own dynastic obsession. These lives remind us that power cannot ignore biology. When lineage is preserved at the expense of diversity, collapse follows. The story does not end in triumph, but in unease. The portraits of queens and princesses hang still in galleries, their eyes fixed on us across centuries. They do not speak, yet their silence conveys the truth. They carried the cost of empires built upon themselves. Their lives became the proof that no throne, however gilded, can escape the consequences of blood treated as currency. In the end, dynasties sought eternity. What they found was extinction.